All right, we could spend the last weeks just talking about this painting and we still wouldn't scratch the surface. It has long been recognized as one of the most important paintings in European history. And um, in the 17th century, at the Spanish court, painters didn't really enjoy high social status, but Velázquez worked his way up through the ranks of the court of King Philip VI. And in 1651, he was appointed palace chamberlain. That brought him status and material reward. And by the time he painted Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor, he had already been a key member of the royal household for over 30 years. And we see this really fascinating scene here because there's a few different levels. So here we have an embedded self-portrait of Velázquez. He's wearing an emblem that denotes his status, this award that he was given by the king. He would never actually paint in something like this. But nevertheless, we do see him here with an easel standing in front of this massive canvas in his studio. And we have another advisor in the background. We have the princess and some of her ladies in waiting here, some of the court dwarves and dog, and everybody seems to be looking up at us. But in fact, we see in the mirror here, in the back, we see the reflection of two people who are in our position. They're off canvas, and it's the King and Queen of Spain. So here we see Velázquez painting their portrait in his studio while their young daughter and other court members wait alongside. Now, we've seen this device before with that small mirror that gives us extra information from the middle of a painting. We've seen that in Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini double portrait from 1434. And guess what? That is in the royal inventory at the Spanish court in Madrid at this moment. So Velázquez, the king, they would have known this painting, and it seems like they're actually trying to cite it here. All right, let's talk about the Dutch Republic. And here we have a totally different religious context. This is a Protestant area of Europe. And we don't have kings, we don't have the kind of mighty Catholic Church as the major art patrons here. Instead, the art patrons tend to be from this rising middle class. City merchants, bankers, smaller courts, and this really changes the art market here. The idea of this new free open market that we often take for granted in our capitalist society today, but the art market, this idea of artists creating work, sometimes on commission, or just sometimes creating works of art and hoping somebody will buy those pieces, this begins to take shape in the Dutch Republic here. All right, let's look at Rembrandt. And here we see Rembrandt's Night Watch. He is showing us here this really boisterous scene. It's one of these new subject matters from the Dutch Baroque, namely the group portrait, where we have a civic militia, a kind of, they were the kind of Rotary Club, Elks Club of the 17th century. And this militia is gathering here around their fearless leader. This is Captain Frans Banning-Cocq here in the center. And they are about to assemble for a parade. These types of commission group paintings, they were very expensive. They were partially charged by size. And what we see here is actually a very unconventional group portrait, and I think that will really become clear when we see other group portraits later. But, we have a sense of narration in this painting, this kind of jumbling, this coming together. Not everybody is looking out at us, but we have this exuberance, this sense of a movement and excitement and confusion. There's a real sense of kind of energy and vibrancy here. Again, that is so unlike Renaissance portraiture and reveals to us this new kind of Baroque approach. All right, here's a slightly more traditional group portrait where we have all of these evenly balanced figures. We can clearly see all of their faces, and we see them here enjoying their banquet. This is their kind of big annual celebration. A lot of times these group portraits, individuals paid for their own image in the portrait, and so this is partially why we have such a good view of all of these individuals here. And we also see this really great kind of diagonal composition, with the banners in the back, that again is a little bit more, gives a sense of energy. There is, of course, this even kind of symmetrical arrangement, but still, some people are sitting, some people are in these smaller conversations. And we know that these banquets were wild parties. There's all sorts of documentation about, different ordinances from cities that tried to regulate these boisterous affairs in the 17th century. Just to really drive this point home, let's look at a 16th century group portrait here. And you can see how staid, how just awkward that earlier portrait looks. The figures, there are some individualized features here, but it's much more cookie cutter. It's much less dynamic. It is much, just much more austere, a little bit more of a grim affair here. And down in Franz Hals's group portrait, we do get a sense of this kind of exuberance. All right, in Peter Sanrudam's church interior, I think this really helps us understand the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. This is a faithful representation of the interior of the Church of St. Bavo in Haarlem. He called himself a portraitist of architecture. And we see this very scientific, modern approach to painting. Now let's compare that with the interior of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican in Rome. Remember that St. Peter's had undergone this huge renovation that began in the Renaissance and finished in the Baroque era. And I mean, look at the difference here. In the Catholic St. Peter's Basilica, every surface is covered with gold, mosaic, painting, sculpture. We have this huge baldachin, this big cover for the high altar. This is impressive. This is sparing no expense. This is complete over-the-top decadence. As opposed to the Protestant church that we see in Sanrudam's painting that shows us what Dutch Protestantism favored. They really, and they took a much more extreme stance than, for example, Luther, who saw a kind of regulated, moderate role for religious images used for educational purposes. And we read about that last week. But here we see no decoration, a complete bareness, just a little bit of furnishings here. In fact, the only furniture that really sticks out is the pulpit. This is where a clergy member would stand to preach, to give a sermon. And both Calvin, who is more of the Dutch reformer, and Luther argued for a faith based on a close understanding of the scriptures, based on the importance of the sermon. And we can see here in these two images the stark contrast between Catholicism, evidenced on the right in St. Peter's Basilica, and Protestantism, illustrated here on the left. All right, you guys, I think I'm going to jump ahead here just for the sake of time, and I want to finish up. You will be reading about Jan Vermeer in the textbook. And so please make sure to note that section on Vermeer. But we're going to end with a Dutch landscape and a Dutch still life for this section. As I mentioned, landscape painting was a very important subject matter for the Dutch Baroque. We see landscape elevated to the same prominence and importance as a history painting or as a religious scene. And look at how expressive the sky is here. In Holland, in the Netherlands, this is very low land. A lot of it is actually under sea, but was drained in this era. And the sky just is so dramatic. In fact, this is often called Dutch light. And here's a picture that a friend took out of a train window in the Netherlands a few years ago, and it has the same kind of effect. The Dutch landscape painters became masterful at capturing the unique features of the Dutch landscape. And this subject matter really appealed to the rising merchant classes, the burgeoning middle class, who were buying art. And that's something we see in the Netherlands, that unlike other Catholic areas, in the Netherlands, a lot of people had access to art. In fact, most people had an original painting in their homes. All right, the last type of subject we're going to see from the Dutch Baroque is the flower still life. A still life simply means a composition of an arrangement of different objects. And here the focus is on flowers. Rachel Reich, particularly, she focused on flower still lifes in her work, and we can see this kind of analysis of light and dark. Here, again, that use of chiaroscuro. She's exploring different color combinations. And we also see flowers at different stages of bloom. We see some flowers dying, some flowers just about to blossom. There's a commentary here on life and death. And this is a very Protestant notion here, to think about, that death comes to all life forms, and that even in the presence of this kind of explosion of color and abundance, that we should also be contemplating death as well. All right, everyone, I'm going to come back with just another short video that's specifically about the French Baroque, which is, of course, as you know, the focus of our reading for this week.